Carl Sagan is not only a good astronomer, but he was a spectacular communicator. And he has the ability to talk to an audience about astronomy, and in particular, his interest in trying to find life beyond Earth. And he was just really compelling. So it's quite appropriate that Lisa Kaltenegger at Cornell University operates something called the Carl Sagan Center for the study of life in the universe.
From SETI to Contact, the story of Jill Tarter.
Well, Carl wrote, along with Josef Shklovsky of the Soviet Union, the first real book about modern SETI. It was called Intelligent Life in the Universe, I think. And that book really did energize lots of students and scientists and engineers about the possibility of actually conducting a search. And it was the first time that at a popular level, there had been a scientific discussion of this idea. So he is early into this game of thinking about life beyond Earth. And he communicated the excitement of that idea and the fact that indeed in the 20th century, we actually had some tools to be able to launch a systematic scientific exploration to try and answer this question. So he was very, very influential. And of course, Cosmos talked to the majesty of the universe and really resonated with the public. Carl was an absolutely brilliant communicator, and we miss him. Absolutely. There have been others that have come after him, but no one individual that still has the impact that he had. He would go out and lecture at a university, and he would have students come up to him and say, Cosmos, that's what made me a scientist. That's what inspired me to become a scientist. I get a little of that today because of Contact, which is now over 20 years old. And particularly young women will come up and say, Contact, that was my favorite movie. And it inspired me to become a scientist. So it's gratifying, but I sure miss Carl. I was back visiting Cornell for some symposium, and Carl said, come on up to the house tonight. We're having a cocktail party. And so I did. That was always fun. And when I got there, Anne Druyan, Carl's wife, and Carl took me off to the corner. And Anne said, Carl's writing a science fiction book. And I said, yeah, I know. The New York Times told us last weekend what kind of an advance he got for this. And we're all jealous as hell, right? And Annie chuckled and she said, well, she said, I think you might recognize one of the characters, but I think you're going to like her. And so I said, oh, come on, Anne. Look, just make sure that Carl doesn't have this female character eat ice cream cones for lunch. And then nobody's going to think it's me, right? Nobody will be confused. And that story is because we were over at NASA Ames Research Center and there was no good food, but we could walk at lunchtime over to a Baskins and Robbins and get ice cream for lunch. And that I got teased a lot about that over the years. But indeed, Carl sent me a pre-publication copy of the book, Contact, and I was going, wait. Carl doesn't know this about me. How did he? How? And it turns out that when I was a fresh PhD, I got invited to a meeting in Washington. And I walked into a room of 80 female PhDs in all kinds of STEM fields. Life-changing experience for me. I had never walked into a room full of women. Very comfortable walking into a room full of men as the only woman, but never a room full of women who were so smart and bright. And we did a little bit of uh, amateur demographics, and it turned out that many of those women had their fathers die when they were young, just like me. Um, Many of those women were competitive, and this was pre-Title IX, so there were no women's sports teams that you could try out for. The only thing you could try out and compete at was um, baton twirling or cheerleading. And so an overwhelming number of the women had been drum majorettes or cheerleaders in their high school years. I was a drum majorette. Uh, the um, the T-Bird, which is a 54 T-Bird, was America's first real sports car. Now, I was in love with that, and the character is as well in Contact. It turns out that I told Carl about this meeting, and we'd written a little report, and I sent him the report. And I'm just very prototypical of all those women. And so Carl got many of these anecdotes or traits or characteristics out of that report I sent him. And because I'm so prototypical, I even thought it was me. I'm often introduced as being the woman who was the inspiration for Ellie Arroway, played by Jodie Foster in the movie Contact. And I am in a little way, but really that character is an amalgamation of traits of female scientists that Carl had worked with. And actually, I think the character is Carl himself, right? I think there's a lot of Carl in that character. And anyway, it was fun to be able to work on a set with Jodie Foster. She's very, very brilliant. She's also very kind, and that was a great privilege to work with her. She told us that she was never going to teach anyone any science, but she was interested in the character of scientists. Were we passionate? Were we supercilious? Do we have big egos? All this kind of thing. And I think she did a grand job with that character. Well, I actually didn't do a whole lot with electronics. I did a lot more hunting and fishing and camping with my dad. And then where all of these pictures in our photo albums from when I was a kid, where I'll be standing there in a beautifully starched little dress with ruffled lace socks and Mary Janes on my feet, holding up a big fish, right? Because these were the tensions in my life growing up. My dad was an outdoorsman, and my mother had been involved in the fashion industry and retail. So she dressed me up, and then I went out and went fishing with my dad. So I had a great childhood though. And maybe, let's see, I think I was about 8 years old. And my dad said, we have to have a talk. Clearly, my mother had talked to him the night before. And so we had this washing machine talk. When my dad and I wanted to talk, he'd set me up on top of a washing machine so that we'd be eye to eye. And he said, your mom thinks that you're getting older and you should be spending more time doing girl things rather than spending time with me. And I just exploded. I mean, you couldn't have said anything that would have made me angrier. I said, that's not fair. Why can't I do both? It's just ridiculous. You shouldn't have to choose one or the other. And, of course, then I started to cry because at 8 years old, I knew if you wanted your dad on your side, right, the tears always help. And so we continued this conversation for a long time. And he finally said, okay, all right, if you're willing to work really hard, then you can do anything you want to do. And I said, okay, I'm going to be an engineer. Now, I don't really think I knew what engineers did, but I knew my dad had a lot of friends, male friends who were engineers, and they seemed to have happy lives. So I said, okay, I'm going to be an engineer. Um, then, sadly, my dad died a couple of years later. And I learned a really important lesson, which is the carpe diem lesson that most people end up learning a bit later in life. But, I always thought my dad was going to be there. And if I didn't ask him the question today, I could ask him the question tomorrow. Well, it doesn't always work that way. And then I had told my dad I was going to be an engineer, and then I just got stubborn about it. And I said, okay, I'm going to be an engineer. And so I went through 5 years of engineering school at Cornell and got an engineering degree. I got a really good education in problem solving, but it turns out I didn't really like the engineering so much. And in addition, I looked around when I was thinking about graduate school and I said, if in general engineers are as boring as my professors, I'm going to find some other problems to work on with these great skills that I've acquired. And so then I started taking all kinds of different courses in graduate school and ended up taking a course from Edwin Salpeter on the star formation and the life cycle of stars. And I was just hooked. I thought, that's stars live, die, right? I, I thought that was amazing to be able to study the life cycle of a star. And so that's what put me into astrophysics. So I all the way along, I just had a lot of fortunate, um, lucky circumstances. I usually describe myself as the chief cheerleader for all things having to do with searching for life beyond Earth. And we have different ways of doing that. Astrobiologists look for what they call biosignatures, trying to discern some disequilibrium chemistry in the atmospheres of planets orbiting other stars. And in my case, teams that I've worked with look for technosignatures. They look for evidence that someone or something out there has developed a technology and that we might be able to detect that technology even over the vast distances between the stars. And we've been doing this for a while now, and I've been cheerleading all the way, and I don't intend to stop anytime soon. When I was about 8 years old, I was down in the Florida Keys, the west coast of Florida, with my aunt and uncle, who were literally beachcombers. And my dad was there, and he was the center of my universe. And I remember one night walking along the edge of the Gulf, holding my dad's hand and looking up in the sky and seeing these magnificent stars because it was a very dark sight. There were no streetlights back then. And I just had this idea that on some planet around one of those stars, there would be a creature walking along the edge of an ocean with their parent, looking up and seeing our sun as a star in their sky. And I don't know what set of circumstances led me to have that particular worldview, but it's been with me for a long time. And then I did an engineering undergraduate degree and a PhD in astrophysics and was nowhere near SETI until um, a very happy accident happened. My first year in graduate school, UC Berkeley acquired the first real desktop computer that had ever been manufactured, the PDP-8S. And it had no language. You had to program the 11 things that it could do by setting all the ones and zeros. You had to program it in octal. And I learned to do that. It's kind of a weird skill, but I learned to do that my first year in graduate school. And much, much later, as I was finally getting ready to finish my graduate degree, that piece of equipment, that computer, was obsolete, and it was given to an X-ray astronomer by the name of Stuart Boyer, who had been following NASA's workshops on um, looking for life beyond the Earth. And he said, wow, UC Berkeley has a radio astronomy telescope, right? That's up at Hack Creek, and my friend Jack Welch runs that. And so he figured out a way that we could take the data in parallel with the astronomers, and we could analyze it, or that is, Stu could analyze it, looking for signals that were engineered as opposed to astrophysical. That's a great idea, but he had no money, and so he went begging, and someone gave him this old computer, and he said, "What the heck do I do with that?" And somebody said, "Ah, Jill's still here. She used to program that thing." And so he came and recruited me to work on his SETI project, which was called Serendip at Hack Creek Observatory. And I programmed that PDP-8 to be the processing engine for that search. So it was just a delightful accident. And of course, then I went off to do a postdoc at NASA Ames, ran into John Billingham, who was starting up the, what did he call it? The Interstellar Communication Committee at NASA Ames. And I said, hey, John, there are more than 40 hours in a week, and I'd like to volunteer with your group and see what you're doing. And so that was it. I've never had any other job except thinking about life beyond Earth. I mean, I never set out to have this as a career path, but I can't think of anything more exciting to work on. And there I was, in the right place with the right set of skills, engineering and astrophysics, and we were off to the races. First of all, being a woman was the first part of it, which meant that at Cornell, as a freshman in the dormitories, I was locked in at 10 o'clock at night, and they didn't open the doors until 6 in the morning, which meant that I was sitting there by myself while all my male colleagues were over in their dorms or in restaurants or bars or something, doing all the problem sets as a group. You take the evens, I'll take the odds kind of thing. But I didn't have that because I was locked in and working on my own. So I got a better education, technically. It didn't do me very well socially, right? I was a bit socially awkward. And then there were all kinds of interesting situations in the classroom. First of all the professors knew me because I was singular. I was sitting there in this sea of male faces. They didn't know most of the male students, at least not early on. So if people wanted an extension on an assignment, they'd send me to go ask for the extension. And that was a little awkward, but I did get to know my professors a little bit better. And there was the day when I was asked not to come to my nuclear physics class the next day because they were going to discuss the dangers of radiation and male sterility, and they just couldn't do that in my presence. And I want, what about female sterility? Come on, guys. Um, and oh, things like, I think I told Sarah Scholes about first year engineering problems and methods, a required course. Everybody had to take it, a lecture room with 300 people. And I was an only child. My mother was very protective of me as she sent me off to Cornell. And so, just the way she used to do when she sent me off to camp as a younger person, she sewed little name tags, Jill Cornell, into all of my clothes, and in particular onto a label of a sweater that I had thrown over my shoulders. And then I flipped it off over the back of my seat, and suddenly we hear this little ripple of tittering and laughter going back from me towards the back of the auditorium and then down the other side. And finally, the professor stopped his lecture and he said, "What's going on?" And thanks, Mom. The label in the sweater had originally said 100% virgin wool, but my mother put my name tape over the word wool. And so they all then knew that I was 100% virgin. It was one of those moments where you just hope the floor would open up and swallow you whole. But of course it didn't, and you got through it and got some laughs out of it later. It was a little, I got good grades. Because I'm locked in my dorm room working by myself. Um, and so there was a lot of tension because my grades were better than many of my other colleagues or students. And then in my junior year, I made a decision that I was going to get married to the man who had been my lab instructor for my freshman physics class. And he was in graduate school, and we knew that I was going to go to graduate school, and we sat down and we worked out all of our finances, and we said, we could do this. We could make this happen. But and partially because I was on a full scholarship from Procter and Gamble. Um, one of those is given each year in the engineering school and one is given in the art school. And I had the engineering scholarship and it was fantastic. Tuition fees, books, all of that kind of thing. And so we obviously counted on that. But when Procter and Gamble found out that I was planning on getting married at the end of my junior year, they took the scholarship away. They said, "You're not serious. You're not going to be a scientist. We're not going to waste this money on educating you just to go be a housewife and have babies." And wow, that was a devastating blow. So I went to the dean of the engineering college. His name was Dale Corson, and who later became president of Cornell University. I said, "Dean Corson, this isn't fair. I mean, I've been on dean's list every semester. I'm a good student, and I intend to continue to be a student and a graduate student and a scientist or engineer." And he looked at me and he kindly said, "You're right. It isn't fair. It isn't fair at all." And I have no idea what he said when he called up the folks at Procter and Gamble, but he got my scholarship back for me. It was wonderful, and I thanked him profusely at that point. And then 20 years later, when he was president of Cornell and had an advisory committee to help him decide how to run the Arecibo telescope in Puerto Rico, which sadly we've just lost now. It's collapsed. But back then, I was on that advisory committee. And so I was able to come up to him all those years later and say, "See, President Corson, thank you for believing in me. I didn't just drop out and become a housewife and have kids, you know. I'm on your advisory committee for this fantastic telescope. And I have to thank you once again." And that felt so good. It felt wonderful to be able to tell him that he'd made such a difference in my life. Over my career, I've been able to watch the universe appear to become more bio-friendly. We don't know that it is. That's what we're trying to find out. But over my career, we have discovered planets around other stars, exoplanets. When we started, we only knew about 9 in our solar system, and then we demoted one of those. But now we know that in the Milky Way galaxy, there are more planets than there are stars. And additionally, we now know about organisms that we call extremophiles, forms of life, not just microscopic, but a lot of them macroscopic, living in environments which, when I was a student, I was taught utterly no chance. That's going to be sterile. No reason to look for life there. But of course, life is there. And it's amazing. So, exoplanets and extremophiles, right? Two big game changers. And now it makes it just seem natural to ask the question, well, with all that potentially habitable real estate out there, is any of it actually inhabited? And so that's just the most natural thing now that we have a different worldview of our cosmos than we did 40 years ago. And so I'm excited. We have a real opportunity in this century to answer that "are any of them inhabited" question. And so I find that really exciting. It makes me mad to be old because I probably am not going to be around long enough to see the end of that story or the beginning of the next phase of our searching. But young people, graduate students now, are going to have a really exciting way forward in this century. SETI could succeed tomorrow, but the instruments that are needed for finding disequilibrium chemistry in the atmospheres of exoplanets, those are going to take a while to build. And then it's going to take another generation to be big enough to actually do the job. For me, the fun part was getting started with this, right? Helping to, roll this rock up the mountain, right? And so I've had the privilege of being in at the beginning. And because I'm a big frog in a small pond, I've had the opportunity to decide a lot of different things about what we should do. And you don't get out of bed in the morning saying, today I'm going to get a signal today, because you're probably going to go to bed disappointed. But you do get out of bed in the morning saying, today I'm going to figure out how to do this better. We're going to do something that we couldn't do last week. We're going to figure out how we can do it today and then how we can do it better next week. And so that's really satisfying. And I've known all along in this business that I'm probably going to have to train my replacement, because this is not a small task that we're undertaking. This is a really large search, and our tools for doing the search are getting better all the time, and now exponentially faster, because computing is improving so rapidly. So, didn't go into this thinking that, it'll be it'll be a good thing to do for the first 5 years of my career, and then I'll find something else to do. No, I've pretty much understood from the beginning, and everybody who works on this program understands that we are probably in this for the long haul. And so we try and find ways to reach out to young engineers and students and excite them about the potential of doing this kind of work. It's not everybody's cup of tea, right? People sometimes approach their science as, I'm going to do something, I'm going to publish a paper, I'm going to do something else, I'm going to publish a paper, and I'm going to be successful all along the way. And sometimes they're wise enough to think, and I'll do something wrong and I'll learn from that. But this idea of working on something that might not succeed during your career is a little dicey, and it takes a certain kind of personality to be eager to do that. And then, of course, there's the other shoe, which is that the funding for this activity is anything but stable. And so not only do I have to say, come join us. No, you might not succeed with finding a signal in your career. And hmm, maybe I can't make salary next month, right? So that's another challenge. We'd like to, now in my cheerleading role, I'd like to work on establishing an endowment so that this kind of activity, this scientific exploration, can be funded stably into the future, because that's what it's probably going to take.
Want to support the channel? Join the Big Think members community, where you get access to videos early, ad-free.